Members of Llanelli Community Heritage and visitors, greetings and welcome to this, our very first virtual lecture. To kick off this series of talks, we've invited Dr. David Davies, who is a popular speaker to our quarterly meetings in Llanelli. Here's a little bit about Dr. David Davies, which I will share with you. David Davies is chairman of the Society for Nautical Research and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. As well as being a prize-winning and best-selling author, writing as J.D. Davies, he won the Samuel Pepys Prize for Pepys's Navy, Ships, Men and Warfare from 1649 to 1689, while his latest book, Kings of the Sea, Charles II, James II and the Royal Navy, won the Anderson Prize and received a Certificate of Merit for the Mountbatten Prize. His series of naval fiction set in the 17th century, The Journals of Martha Quinton, was described by the Times as a series of real panache, and he's also published a trilogy set in the Tudor period. Now, more importantly, he's from Llanelli. He's a Llanelli boy, although he's living in Bedford. As well as being a very good friend of mine, his father was also a very good friend of mine who I worked with in Trostre for over 10 years. So without further ado, I shall pass you over to Dr. David Davies.
Thanks very much, Lynn. And I shall start straight away by trying to share my screen. And let's hope that this works as it should. And if I bring this up now, hang on a minute, there we go. You should hopefully now see the title slide. Sir John Stepney's Cunning Plan, Echoes of Blackadder. And I put a question mark after saying the final word on the Stepney Chambers inheritance. Some of you will have heard me speak on this topic before. And I think I've spoken on it more than once in Llanelli. It and the whole history of the Stepney family has really sort of absorbed me for 20 plus years now. It's all Lynn's fault, as I keep telling him. He started me off on this. But this question of the Stepney Chambers inheritance, how did Llanelli House and the whole Stepney estate pass from Sir John Stepney, the 8th Baronet, the last in the line of them, but last but one at any rate, and go to William Chambers, who seemed to have absolutely no connection with him at all. And I've sort of worked away at this over the years. And really this talk is both a combination of some of the finds, if you like, that I'd made before, and to an extent I've talked about before, and some new ideas, some new material as well, that's only really come up in the last year or two. So with that in mind, let's start talking about Sir John Stepney and the infamous will. There on the left is Sir John, the famous Reynolds portrait that's now in Llanelli House, obviously when he was quite a young man. There don't seem to be any reliable pictures of what he looked like when he was older. Certainly when he was 60 odd, and that's the age he is when he draws up the will, the first page of which you can see there on the right, the will which was drafted in 1802 and then obviously goes into effect on Sir John's death in October 1811. So just a little bit of imagination really in terms of aging the person on the left to get an idea of the person who wrote or at least authorized the will that you can see on the right. It's after writing the will in 1802 that Sir John goes abroad, and he then stays abroad for the rest of his life. He's mainly in the lands of the Austrian Empire. And that included in those days Northern Italy and obviously Vienna and the areas around there. And in 1811, he finally came to this town on a map from the period, Turnau, which was then not that far from Vienna, sort of northeast of Vienna. But since then, of course, you've had all the border changes, you've had 2 world wars, and Turner for many years was behind the Iron Curtain. It's now named Trnava, and as such, it's a city in the Slovak Republic, and that's where Sir John died. But I'd known about Trnava for quite a long time, and I decided eventually that I wanted to go there to see if I can track down any information about his death, to see if I could actually find a tomb, for example. And so a couple of years ago, I went to Trnava, and it's an absolutely lovely place. It really is a very, very nice town. Very little known by tourists at all, which is both a good and a bad thing in a sense. But if you're looking for a getaway after all the rules all relax and you want somewhere that's not going to be inundated with all the other people going to all the obvious destinations, I can really recommend this place. As I say, it's a lovely town. The people are tremendous. They're very, very friendly. And I was astonished by the number who spoke really, really good English. So I had a great trip over there. And I did come across quite a lot of very good material about Sir John Stepney and his death. For example, this is the building he died in. It was then the Black Eagle Hotel. And it's now the facade of the town theatre. And what they've actually done very, very carefully, I don't know if you can make this out, is to put netting over the facade while they were refurbishing it, but the netting actually had the image of the facade on it anyway. So it looked exactly the same, even though they were working away behind it. But as I say, that is the building where Sir John Stepney died in October 1811, pretty much unaltered. And I'd like to think that he might have had the really big room there with the big windows over the entrance, but who knows? I don't think we'll ever be able to know that. But it was a really, really good experience. And while I was there, I went into the local archives where the people were very, very helpful. And there's some really good stuff about his funeral in the archives in Trnava. For example, there's this document, it's in Latin. Thankfully, it wasn't in Slovak, which made my life a lot easier, because you never know how far Latin O-level grade 5 from Llanelli Grammar School many, many years ago is going to take you. But because it's going to be quite difficult to make out the script, I've highlighted a couple of things in it. There's the name Stepney, and it describes him as an English minister, so government minister. He had been ambassador to Dresden and then to Frederick the Great in Berlin. And it tells us, for example, there, you can see the figure 600, that's 600 bricks. And those were the bricks that were used in building his burial vault. He specified in his will exactly what sort of burial vault he wanted, what it was meant to look like, and so forth, exactly. And here you've got the order for 600 bricks. We know how much they cost, and so forth. So we know this vault was built. And we know where it was. It was in what was called then and is called now the New Cemetery in Trnava. And this is the entrance to it. And I spent several hours one day wandering around this entire cemetery, going back and forth up the rows, trying to find Sir John Stepney's tomb. The nice little memorial chapel directly in front of me here isn't it. Unfortunately, initially my hopes were raised, I thought it might be, but it's not. Because what they evidently do in Slovakia is to recycle the same plots every 50 years or so. So although the cemetery has been in exactly the same place and exactly the same size since the beginning of the 19th century, there's virtually no grave in there that's more than about 50 or 60 years old. So I think that's probably slightly more ecologically friendly than some of the things that we do sometimes with cemeteries, but there we are. So anyway, it was obviously when he died in Trnava that the will went into effect. And there is an account actually in the Times of when it was opened in Gray's Inn in London in January 1812. And presumably some of the family members were there expecting to get lots of riches and so forth from Sir John's will. The Times reported that they reacted to it with astonishment, because what Sir John actually did, of course, was something absolutely bizarre. And he produces a huge list of inheritors, but with some very, very specific points about them. First of all, he says that for their lifetimes only, the survivors of these three people, survivor or survivors, would hold the estate, the Stepneys estates in Carmarthenshire, in Llanelli, including Llanelli House. These would hold it for their lives and their lives only. Henry V, Duke of Beaufort, but in 1811, he was already dead. He'd been dead for 8 years, so we can discount him. Secondly, Richard Henry Alexander Bennet, who's a very wealthy landowner from the Isle of Wight. And thirdly, George, the first Marquis of Cholmondeley, who eventually dies in 1827. And we know from lots and lots of evidence that these three men were some of Sir John's closest friends. Now, quite why he makes this arrangement, we have no idea. There have been all sorts of suggestions over the years. Some of them are completely impossible and bizarre, like the one that they'd all been prisoners of war in France. No, they hadn't been. There's been a suggestion, for example, that it might have been a way of repaying them for debts he'd run up from them at gambling tables, and that's a lot more plausible, it has to be said. But I'll come back to some other ideas about why he might have given it to these three people in turn later in the talk. Now, clearly from the dates there, Bennet dies only a couple of years after the will goes into effect. And so it's Cholmondeley who actually owns the Llanelli and Carmarthenshire estates of the Stepneys for 15 years. And he's almost completely discounted in the history of the town, but very, very colourful, very important figure. And although he obviously never came to Llanelli, he should perhaps be a little bit better known. Then the next in line after them is Lieutenant Colonel Orlando John Williams, who I'll come to in a minute. Then Lieutenant Richard Falkland, Royal Navy, and then William Chambers. Then, and only then, Thomas Stepney, Sir John's younger brother. Carrying on down the family, Eliza Gulston, his niece, John Stepney Cowell, his nephew, Frances Head, another niece, Richard Henry Alexander Bennet Jr., son of the above, captain of the Royal Navy, Joseph Gulston, so from the same branch of the Stepney line, the grandson of another of his sisters, William Stepney Cowell, brother of John, and George Viscount Malpas, the son of the Marquis of Cholmondeley. Now, the point about all of these people and why they're different to the first three at the top is that the provision in the will was that these would inherit, if you like, in order of seniority. So whoever was alive at Cholmondeley's death, or at least the death of the last one of the three at the top, would then inherit the estate, but in a different way, because the next inheritor, whoever it was, would inherit it in what was called tail mail, which again I'll come back to a bit later in the talk. But now, rather than it just being for life, pardon me, it would be for the named individual for life, but if that named individual then had a legitimate son, not daughter, then it would pass to that son and then on from there, possibly. As I say, there's a few caveats to this, which we'll come back to. So it's an extraordinarily complicated procedure. I mean, it's you've got a total there of what, 14 people who could at some point inherit Llanelli and substantial additional lands in Carmarthenshire. It's a very, very strange setup. I mean, there are plenty of strange things that are done in 18th and 19th century wills, but this is particularly bizarre, and so bizarre that obviously, as I say, the Times and so on comments on it. But clearly, after the three who are at the top of the list, the next name is that of Orlando John Williams. And he is the man who Stepney clearly intended to become the owner of the estate. He was a lieutenant colonel of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, whose flag you can see there. Very, very famous regiment, partly because, well, largely because of their tremendous heroics in the First World War at the Battle of the Somme. But at the time that Williams is effectively the second in command of that regiment, it's a very new unit, and it's uncertain whether he actually ever went to Canada at all. But he is clearly the intended heir. If he doesn't live long enough, then the next in line is Lieutenant Richard Falkland of the Royal Navy. He's had quite an active career, at least in his early stages. He's fought in the glorious 1st of June, famous battle in 1794, which you can see there in that particular painting. So Falkland is the next. And then, and only then, we come to a name that's very well known in the history of Llanelli, obviously, William Chambers. And the building there is Bicknor Court in Kent, and that's the building that Chambers owned before he came to Llanelli, as he eventually does. Bit of a spoiler alert there, in case you didn't know that he eventually does inherit, but there we are. So, now all of this obviously begs the question again of who are these people and how does Chambers eventually come into possession of the estate? Well, when I first talked on this topic, which is now getting on for 20 years ago, I had come across the first big revelation, which was that I had found firm evidence to show that the three people, Williams, Falkland, and Chambers, were the three illegitimate sons of Sir John Stepney. And here's some of the proof of that. First of all, this letter from Lord Auckland to Lord Grenville, saying that Sir John Stepney had left this tiny annuity to his brother, and the same to Williams. That wasn't true, incidentally. He'd left Williams £3,000 by Lady Almeria. The rest to poor Lord Cholmondeley and poor Mr. Bennet. Major sarcasm there, because they were two of the richest men in England. Lady Almeria was Lady Almeria Carpenter, who you can see in the painting there. Famous society beauty of the 1760s, 1770s. And she was the mother of Colonel Williams. She eventually, after she and Stepney have broken up, she eventually takes up with one of King George III's many brothers, the Duke of Gloucester, who was generally regarded as being the most stupid of the brothers, and that was a fair competition, I can tell you. Second set of proof comes from this lady, Eliza Gulston, whose bookplate you can see on the left and whose memorial stone you can see on the right. You probably can't make out the writing, but she is named as Eliza Gulston Stepney because she does eventually inherit the Stepney estate. Unfortunately, she inherits it when she's already 86 and blind, but the Stepney name still goes on to her memorial there in Ealing Church in London, where it's very, very difficult to access, incidentally. But Eliza wrote a tremendous amount. She writes loads of letters, she writes diaries, and so for a lot of these are in the record office in Carmarthen. Unfortunately, I'd gone through all of this material long before the record office in Carmarthen had its slightly unfortunate sequence of events, long before COVID, which led to it closing for some years. For example, in her diary on the 11th of February 1826, in the Herald of yesterday is announced the death of Sir John Stepney's famous Mrs. Chambers in her 84th year. I suppose her son will secure her papers or what infamy might come to light. And many years later, another relative of both Eliza and Sir John Stepney, Alan James Gulston of Derwydd in Llandybia, or near Llandybia rather, wrote this passage, and it basically tells a story of how Mrs. Chambers, the then Mrs. Chambers, was actually originally from Llanelli, so presumably Sir John knew her before she was married. She lived in St. James's Square in London, and when her husband was out, she'd put a rose in the window, and that was the signal to Sir John, who was waiting outside, to nip inside. And obviously one of the results at one point was that 9 months later, along comes William Chambers. And it's an interesting, well, there's several interesting aspects of this. I mean, things were a lot looser then, perhaps, than one might expect, certainly looser than the Victorian era. And Chambers' notional father, the husband of this Llanelli woman, accepted William as his son, although everybody seems to have known there was actually Sir John's son. And there's actually many, many instances of that happening in that period, in the Regency period. It's not unique at all. And notice, even what, 50 odd years after the death of Mrs. Chambers, 20 odd years after the death of her son, William, Alan James Gulston is still writing the name Chambers in code. There is still something secret about this. You know, it's still a shameful thing that's not to be spoken out loud, which is an interesting point about Victorian morality, I think. But clearly Victorian morality wasn't around when Sir John Stepney was having the very colourful life that he had. Talking about colourful lives, of course, Bridgerton has been a huge hit recently on TV, and it really did strike me while I was watching it. You know, the goings on in Bridgerton would have absolutely nothing on the Stepneys. Netflix really ought to spend millions on the history of the Stepneys, the doings in Llanelli House. It would absolutely clean up. Anyway, we now move into some much more complicated territory, and this is where I'm really dealing with the newer material that I've been working on and thinking about and trying to sort out in relation to this inheritance. Here's a Latin term, filius nullus, and it's in front of a famous painting about the stern father banishing from his door his wayward daughter, who has in her arms the infant born on the wrong side of the blanket. And there were various oddities, or at least there seem to be oddities about the status of illegitimate children in this period. The legal position is summed up by those two Latin words, filius nullus, no man's son. An illegitimate child had no legal rights. They had no parentage in the sense of having no father, as far as the law was concerned. And that meant, of course, that they couldn't inherit. They could not inherit property. So there was no way, when Sir John Stepney died, for example, that the eldest surviving illegitimate son of the three of them could have automatically inherited the estate. It simply didn't work that way. And that's actually the situation that endured until 1926. And the remaining legal restrictions on illegitimate children and illegitimate adults come to that weren't removed finally until 1987. We're talking that recently that some of these legal ideas still applied. So anyway, this was the point. The three sons, no matter what Stepney thought of them, and clearly from the money he's giving them, particularly Williams and Falkland, and he tries, for example, many times to really promote Falkland's career and so forth, he clearly cares a lot about his three illegitimate sons, but he's constrained by the law. We need to go a bit further into the law now. Types of heir in that period. You can have heirs of the body, And the principle here, the main principle, was male primogeniture. In other words, the ideal way for a succession to pass, where there's no quibble, no interruption at all, is father to son, and then eventually to grandson. Notice I'm talking about males only at this point. That had been true of the Stepney estate for a very, very long time indeed, but over 100 years, that it had passed down from father to son uninterrupted, heirs of the body. If there weren't any heirs of the body, you went out to the heirs general, siblings, cousins, and so forth of the holder of the estate. This, though, is an interesting point, that the succession to the title and to the estate aren't necessarily synonymous. And so although Tom Stepney, there in that wonderful miniature that's in the Victoria and Albert Museum, could and did inherit the title, he became the 9th baronet, he did not automatically inherit the estate, because, of course, he wasn't heir of the body of Sir John Stepney. It didn't matter that he was an heir of the body of the previous Stepney baronet, their father, the 7th baronet. He wasn't of Sir John's body, and that meant that he was just one of the heirs general. Quite what he thought about this is another matter, because obviously he should have been the obvious inheritor, the obvious heir. Now then, not only do we have different types of heir, we have different types of estate. Estates of freehold, as they were called, and that's a term very, very familiar to all house owners these days, obviously, were divided into 2 types. Estates of inheritance, first type, the most common being fee simple. If you owned an estate by fee simple, it meant that the owner and his heirs, notice his again, held it generally, absolutely, and simply, without mentioning what heirs, but referring that to his own pleasure. And that's from the great contemporary law book in the late 18th century, Sir William Blackstone's Laws of England. So this is the definitive last word. Filius nullus, incidentally, comes from the same source. Now, usually this means that things just pass down through the heirs of the body via male primogeniture, very, very straightforwardly and so on. But in theory, if you held an estate in fee simple, you could do what you like with it. You could sell it, for example. You could sell it to somebody else. You could decide to divide it among lots of daughters and so forth. There were all kinds of things you could do with it. So that's one type of estate. Then you've got estates not of inheritance. And the one that we're concerned with, there were various types, but the most important one, fee-tail or entailed, where an estate is bequeathed to a specific named inheritor, possibly also specifying his or her heirs of the body. Notice we've got a her in it now. And what they often do is to give this for 3 lives. In other words, grandfather, son, grandson, plus an additional 21 years. But legally, it had to be people who were alive at the time the will was made, plus 21 years. So, in a nutshell, what Sir John Stepney does in his will is this. He holds the estate in fee simple. He is the owner, absolutely. There's no doubt about it. And that, of course, is why Sir John can sell the estate if he wants to. And he makes several attempts to. In the 1780s, 1790s, they don't come to anything, but he had tried to sell Llanelli House and the lands in Carmarthenshire several times. He did eventually sell the Llangennech estate, another of the Stepney estates, which had come down to him via his grandmother. So what he does is he, in the will, sets up a fee entail. He entails the estate so that it will go to a specific named inheritor. In other words, the survivor of the list, the senior survivor of the list we discussed earlier. And then it would go from there. So it's now in fee tail. And this is much more rigorous, because if you hold it in fee tail, you cannot then sell it. You are hemmed in, because basically you are still governed by the terms of Sir John Stepney's will. That controls everything. Now, this might all sound very dry legalistic stuff, and that there surely can't be much dramatic interest and so forth in these incredibly tangled legal niceties, but you'd be wrong. Some very, very famous works have as one of their major plot devices a fee tail, an entailed estate. And here are just two examples. Pride and Prejudice on the left. In Pride and Prejudice, remember, the father, Mr. Bennet, has the girls, but the girls won't inherit because the estate is entailed on a cousin, a male cousin. Downton Abbey, bizarrely, coming right up to date, had as one of its central plot lines the fact that the estate was entailed. And so although it seems very legalistic and very technical in some respects, it's actually been a tremendous plot device for authors over many, many years, because it gives you all sorts of potential for conflict. You know, what if the distant heir is somebody you don't get on with or you don't even know? Or in the case of Downton Abbey, the distant heir then goes down on the Titanic and you end up with an even more distant heir. So there are all sorts of glorious complications that you can bring in to all of this kind of thing. And we know the Stepney estate is in fee simple because we're told that here's Sir Thomas Stepney, the 5th Baronet's will from 1745, and there it says, I am seized in fee simple. And this is language from the feudal period, obviously, because this is when these types of landholding were set up. This is the feudal system we are talking about, with these various systems and structures. Now, the problem that Sir John Stepney has got when he makes the will in 1802 is this. He has no obvious heirs. Well, he has no heirs, full stop, to inherit it in fee simple, just through straightforward heirs of the body, male primogeniture. There aren't any. So he has got to create an entail, and he has got to take into account the law and the status of the other people as potential heirs. And this is where he has a huge problem. If you think about the people he's named in the will, and we'll go through them now, and what the law expects. The law expects that you will basically operate on the principle of 3 generations. So if we take him as the 1st generation, we then take Williams, Falkland, Chambers, all the rest of them as the next generation. Where does the 3rd generation come from? There isn't one, because if you look at all the heirs, none of them, not one, have actually got legitimate heirs in 1802. Williams is unmarried. Falkland is newly married, no children as yet. Chambers is unmarried. Tom Stepney, 42, is unmarried. Eliza Gulston is unmarried. John Stepney Cowell is 11. Frances Head is unmarried and she's 22. Richard Henry Alexander Bennet is unmarried, never does marry. Joseph Gulston is 13. William Stepney Cowell is 9, as is George Viscount Malpas. There is no following generation. So, to suggest another possibility for how he makes the will, makes these bequests in the way that he does. The first three names in the list start to make a bit more sense: Beaufort, Bennett, Cholmondeley, because by giving it to them for life, at least by the time that the last of them dies, surely one of these potential inheritors will have married and had a legitimate son. Now, the problem, of course, will be that they don't in many respects. Obviously, the saga of William Chambers Sr. and Jr. is a very tangled one indeed. I've also spoken about that incidentally before. And the only ones of the people on that list, that very long list, who actually have legitimate sons in due course are John Stepney Cowell, Joseph Gulston, and George Viscount Malpas. So clearly two of the three are going right down to the bottom of the list. Actually, of course, in the long run, as we know, it works out that William Chambers dies, Eliza Gulston dies, John Stepney Cowell inherits, becomes Sir John Stepney Cowell Stepney, of course, and his son then becomes Sir Arthur, and so on, and so it passes on. But clearly Sir John can't know that in 1802. He can't know any of it. What he's doing, therefore, I would argue, is he's hedging his bets on a grand scale. He's got all these potential heirs general, but he has got no idea which of them are going to live long enough, which of them are going to marry, which of them are going to have legitimate sons. So he is trying to cover all the angles he possibly can. That's the way I see it. A lawyer might tell me I'm talking complete rubbish, but there you go. I mean, that's the job of lawyers at the end of the day, isn't it? So it's very, very complicated. As I say, what eventually happens is that the Stepney estate, and here we can see the centerpiece of it, with the map slightly tilted off to one side, admittedly, but you can see Llanelli House there in the middle, as middle left as number 1, just to the left of where it says Market House, or the church across the road, as it is now. And this map is taken from the big estate map that Cholmondeley has drawn up in 1814 when he's inherited the estate. And this is therefore in his archives up in Chester, in the County Record Office in Cheshire. So that's what happens. It goes basically to Cholmondeley until Cholmondeley dies in 1827. Then the next surviving name on Sir John Stepney's original list is that of William Chambers. So it goes to him. If William Chambers had had a legitimate son, it would have gone to that legitimate son. It doesn't. He doesn't have one. William Chambers Jr. is illegitimate as well. And hence, by various strange degrees and machinations, it eventually ends up with John Stepney Cowell. So there you go. It's a very, very tangled story. Whether this will turn out to be the final word in the story of this inheritance, I'm not so sure. I may well still find out other things which will change all the thinking around yet again. But it strikes me as being, quite an extraordinary story, really. And obviously it then leads to literally decades where members of the family, the heirs of the people who are on the original list, are really just warring with each other. They're at each other's throats at times as to, the order, the pecking order, as it were, that should actually exist. And on that note, I shall finish. And thank you very much indeed for your attention. You may, of course, now feel like the people there in that wonderful Regency cartoon. I did originally intend that to show the the sort of lifestyle that Sir John and his friends lived. But of course, it can have a double meaning as well, depending on how you feel, after probably learning far too much for comfort about 18th century property inheritance laws. But with all of that in mind, I shall stop screen sharing and hand back to Lynn.
Well, thank you very much, David. A fascinating lecture. I've seen two of the other ones, and each one is very, very different, and more explanations about the Stepney family and what a dysfunctional family they were.
Yes.
I've noted a few questions, if you don't mind. If
Yeah,
I can
by all means.
The first one is, what happened to Orlando Williams and Richard Falkland, who should have had priority over William Chambers?
Yeah, well, this is the thing. If they'd lived long enough and they'd had legitimate sons, I mean, they would have been the people. You know, you'd now have probably something like either, well, you have got a William Street in Llanelli, of course, but you might have an Orlando Street, or you might have had a Falkland Street, or all these sorts of things. Williams, like a lot of British people, that when there's a brief peace with France in 1802-3, the Peace of Amiens, he goes off to France because obviously they've been deprived of Paris and the culture and so forth for so very long. Then Napoleon has this huge clampdown. He knows war is coming back. He arrests literally thousands of British people who happen to be in France at that time, totally contrary to international law. So, Williams is banged up in a French prison, as indeed is William Chambers, who had done the same thing, as are quite a few other people as well. And Williams, while he's in prison, he has an affair with a French woman. They have a son, but of course they're not married. So the son can't inherit the estate. Williams then dies before the end of the war and before he can go back to Britain. Falkland, on the other hand, stays in Britain. He's got various naval postings, but he and his wife only have 4 daughters. So, of course, they can't inherit it either. Even though it's a legitimate marriage, they're legitimate daughters, they can't inherit because the will specifies sons. And when his first wife dies, Falkland does marry very, very quickly and decently quickly to a woman who's about 20 years younger than him, obviously hoping he'll get a son finally, but then he dies a few months later, so that doesn't happen either. And if I do get invited back to talk to Llanelli Community Heritage again, hopefully when we can all meet in person, the talk I would want to give would be about what we'll have more detail, let's say, about what happens to Williams and Chambers while they're in prison in France, because there are a lot of interesting new details that have come to light again in very, very recent times, which will be well worth going into, really. Again, I mean, you know, Bridgerton, I mean, absolutely nothing compared to the sort of scandals that we're going to be talking about with them. So yes, I mean, in a nutshell, neither Williams nor Falkland fulfill the terms of Sir John Stepney's will. The only one who lives long enough to fulfill part of it is William Chambers, but then he can't fulfill the next part because he doesn't have a legitimate son.
Yes, no, and the next one is, how long did the entail created by Sir John's will last for?
Yes, the law does change, I think in about 1833. And what can then happen is that you can end an entail if the life tenant of the estate and the eventual heir entail agree to do so. And in 1850, a deal is basically done between William Chambers and not John Stepney Cowell, because if you think about it, John Stepney Cowell, under the terms of Sir John's will, would only have been tenant for life, because it would then have been John's son who would be the inheritor in tail. And his son was Frederick Cowell Stepney. Actually, they weren't Stepney by this point, it was still Cowell, Frederick Cowell. And the eldest of the 3 sons. And Fred was very keen to get his hands on the money from the estate because he had very expensive habits, mainly traveling several times around the world, and going and meeting Native American tribes and going to Japan, seeing the new emperor being installed and so on. He spent money like water, and so he really wanted this. And so he basically did a deal with William Chambers by which they disentailed the estate, as I say, in 1850. Of course, that then meant that the Gulstons, who would have inherited again when the last of Sir John Stepney's sons, I'm sorry it's getting so complicated now, Sir John Cowell Stepney's sons had died, the Gulstons would have got it. The Gulstons were furious and remained furious for 60, 70 years that this had happened. And even after Sir Arthur Stepney dies in 1909, the Gulstons are still trying to prove that what this disentailing deed, as it was called, was invalid. They just wouldn't accept, you know, that this had been legal. They were trying to prove that Fred Cowell Stepney had been mad sort of 30, 40 years earlier. And it never got anywhere. And of course, Fred Cowell Stepney is the really interesting one, who was a big friend of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and was actually one of the leading lights of the early communist movement. So again, I mean, there's a huge can of worms with Fred, let's say.
Well, there's a lot of Llanelli connection names there. I noticed Frederick Street, William Street, Stepney Street, and of course we have Llanelli House.
Yes.
If they made a film in Llanelli or Llanelli House, what if those walls in Llanelli House could talk?
Oh yes. Oh, yes. Just a bit.
I'm sure that many people in Llanelli have been asking the question, which I'm sure you're ready to answer, is when will your book be coming out?
The book, yes. I'd hoped it would be out long before now, several years before now, but obviously several things got in the way. One was the closure of the Carmarthenshire Archives that I alluded to earlier. Another one is obviously this pandemic, which has caused a few problems to say the least. And for example, I need to get to Belfast to look at some material over there, and there's no chance of that at the moment, because the other thing that happens is that I've now been doing this for so long, working for so long, that more and more material starts coming to light. You know, you suddenly discover, oh, right, there's this new article, there's this new thesis that's been written and so on. You've got to go off and down another rabbit hole. But I mean, the point is that there is now a complete text. Yes, there are some more references I would like to look at and so on, so a bit more work to do on it. But I really do want to get it out as quickly as possible. So once I think travel is a bit easier and so forth, then hopefully it can come out relatively quickly, because as I say, there is a complete book. So hopefully it will appear internationally sometime before the next pandemic comes along, let's say.
Thank you very much, David. Before we sort of conclude this first ever virtual lecture, I'd like to invite members of Llanelli Community Heritage, or even their guests, to submit some questions. They can submit them to our website, which can be found at llanellich.org.uk, which you can see on my nice little board behind. I don't have a Union flag, by the way, but I've got this board there, right? And this is the part where I would say, hand over to you a nice bottle of red wine. Unfortunately, that's not possible, but I'm sure when you're in this part next, you could sample a few of the hops internationally when we meet again.
I shall look forward to it. Definitely look forward to it.
Thank you very much indeed. We look forward to you again.
Thanks a lot, Lynn. Thank you. Bye.
Brilliant.